Hey guys, this is Donnie with VMP Performance. Today I'm going to show you how to install one of our supercharger kits on your 2011 to 2014 F-150 with the 5.0 in it. It takes a little bit of time and a lot of work, so make sure you have at least 10 to 15 hours set aside for this. The first step is going to be to open the under hood fuse compartment and remove the top right relay. That controls your fuel pump. We're going to pull that out and then get in the truck and cycle the key 2 to 3 times just to evacuate any remaining fuel in the lines. Next, disconnect your negative battery cable by using an 8mm wrench or socket. After you've disconnected the battery, you're going to need to remove your intake tube. To do this, we're going to disconnect the MAF, disconnect the PCV, and the clean air tube. Whether it's stock or an aftermarket one as shown, just make sure you remove all the lines and then undo the hose clamps. To remove the air filter housing, whether it's stock or aftermarket, you need to undo the plastic clips and then just lift up and out. After you've removed your air filter assembly and the intake tube, we're going to remove our brake aspirator. Remove the hose clamp off of the intake manifold, unplug the sensor at the brake booster, and simply pop the hose out. We're going to remove our fuel rails next. The first step is to remove the foam fuel rail covers and then disconnect the fuel line fitting. Make sure to have a rag handy because there will be some extra gas left over even though we evacuated the system. You'll need a 10mm socket to remove the 4 bolts that hold down the factory fuel rails. Make sure to set those 4 bolts aside as we will need to use them later. Before removing your fuel rails and injectors, make sure to unplug all 8 injector connectors. After you've got them all unplugged, you can lift up and away with the injectors and the rail. After you've got your fuel rails and injectors removed, we're going to disconnect our 2 PCV lines and discard them as they will not be reused. Next, we're going to remove our intake manifold. The first step is to disconnect the electrical connectors on the throttle body and the EVAP solenoid. Then remove the hard line going to the EVAP solenoid by lifting up and pressing in on the green connector and setting to the side. To remove our intake manifold, you'll need to loosen the 6 8mm bolts found on each side of the manifold. Then we can lift up and out. You can press the heater hose line under the throttle body like I did and then lift the manifold up and out, or you can disconnect it now as we're going to disconnect it later anyway. Make sure to remove the 2 push pins that hold the wire harness to the back of the intake manifold before just yanking it out. It may require the use of a plastic trim tool. After removing your intake manifold, clean the ports on the cylinder head and then tape them off, just to ensure nothing can fall down into the engine while we are working. After taping up the cylinder heads, we're going to drain our coolant. To do this, you'll need to loosen the coolant drain above the passenger side frame rail. To ensure you make less of a mess, you can slide a 3/8 hose onto the nipple that is right underneath the drain. After all the coolant has drained, make sure to retighten the red coolant drain. After draining the coolant, you can remove the driver's side heater hose fitting by squeezing in the 2 plastic tabs and lifting up and off. Next, we're going to remove our coolant reservoir. After removing the heater hose, you'll need to disconnect the line going from the coolant reservoir to the water outlet. Remove the constant tension clamp and then lift the hose up and off of the outlet. Next, remove the clamp and the hose going from the reservoir to the front of the engine. Before we can remove our reservoir and stock air box, we need to remove the hood sensor. Remove the nut using a 10mm wrench or socket and set it aside to be installed later. After the hood sensor is out of the way, you can use a 13mm wrench or socket to remove the 2 bolts holding our airbox assembly and reservoir to the truck. The last hose we need to remove before we take out our reservoir goes to the top of the radiator on the driver's side. Remove the clamp, pull the hose off, and the hose will come out when we remove the reservoir. After removing the reservoir and intake, we can modify our knock sensor harness. To do this, we'll need to remove the harness from the vehicle. After you have it on the bench, cut carefully where the harness splits. Make sure to just cut through the sheathing, not cut all the way through to the wires. Split the harness all the way back to the factory sticker found on the harness. Then, remove the plastic elbows that are found in each of the connectors. After you have your harness modified, make sure to use electrical tape to cover any exposed wires. Once the harness is modified, you can reinstall in the vehicle. Next, we'll need to orient our knock sensors to give room for the intake manifold and air cooler. To do this, orient the sensors as close to the cylinder head as possible without touching. Then tighten the bolts holding the knock sensors down and you're ready to go. After your knock sensors are adjusted and the harness is modified, we're going to remove the stock serpentine belts. Before removing the belts, make sure to loosen the 3 10mm bolts on the water pump while the belt is helping hold the pulley to not spin. Then, you can use a 15mm socket and a ratchet to remove the accessory drive belt. You'll need to set that aside for later as we will reinstall this belt. To remove the AC belt, the tensioner does not require a socket. Just insert a 3/8 ratchet and extension into the tensioner and remove that belt as well. That belt can be discarded as we will not use it later. After the belts are removed, you can go back and loosen the water pump pulley bolts and remove the water pump pulley. Once again, set that pulley and the bolts aside as they will be reused later. After you've removed your water pump pulley, you can remove the AC system belt tensioner and idler pulley. To do this, we'll use a 10mm socket on the tensioner and a 13mm socket on the grooved idler. You can remove and discard both of those as they will not be going back on the truck. There's 4 valses on the engine you need to cut off or grind down. The first being in the intake valley, the other 3 being on the passenger side of the timing cover. Before you begin this step, make sure to also tape off any other coolant or engine breather openings. When grinding the 3 fittings on the front of the timing cover, They typically need to be about 1/4 inch or less off the face of the timing cover. To verify you have ground down the one in the intake valley far enough, simply set your lower intake on to verify clearance. Here you can see the 4 Vosses that we had to grind. After the grinding is finished, we're going to need to remove the water outlet from the top of the driver's side cylinder head. Remove the 2 10mm bolts, and then the constant tension clamp and the hose from it. You can discard this and set it off to the side as it will not be reused, and you will need to install the provided 15 to 17 Mustang water outlet. Use the provided 15 to 17 Mustang water outlet and re-tighten down the 2 bolts using an 8mm. Before installing the lower intake, make sure to slip the PCV hose onto the fitting on the back of the intake and install the supplied clamp before putting the intake manifold on the truck. After your water neck is swapped out, you can install the intake manifold with the previously installed PCV line. After verifying you clear the Voss in the intake valley, then grab the 6 provided 10mm bolts and start them all by hand. You may need to wiggle the intake around a little to verify they all start cleanly and get at least 2 to 3 threads of engagement before you put a wrench on them. Once you have them all started by hand, you can use a 10mm socket and a ratchet to tighten them down in a crisscross pattern. After our intake manifold is installed, we're going to install our front end accessory drive bracket, or FIAD for short. To install the FIAD bracket, we'll need to remove the 3 stock 10mm bolts from the water pump and timing cover, as well as the top bolt and nut on the top of the timing cover. After removing the 10mm nut, take the ground strap off, and then you can remove the 13mm stud. After removing the 4 stock bolts, you can install the supplied FIAD bracket using the supplied 5 bolts. The 3 black ones will be installed in the bottom 3 locations of the FIAD bracket. The 2 much longer silver ones will be installed in the top portion. You can install the top right bolt now, but before you install the top left bolt, you'll need to drill out your ground strap using a step bit. Before installing the top left bolt in the FIAD bracket, drill out your ground strap using a step bit and then install through the bolt. The last bolt that we're going to put in our FIAD bracket needs to be removed from the timing cover. It is the passenger side bottom bolt that is next to the crankshaft pulley. Remove it and thread it into the last hole in our FIAD bracket. After torquing down your FIAD bracket, you're going to need to get under the truck so we can do our AC pulley and crankshaft pulley modifications. First step is to remove the 18mm stock crankshaft bolt in the crankshaft pulley. Then, using a 3-jaw crankshaft puller, you'll need to walk the crankshaft pulley off of the crank. You can then either remove the crankshaft pulley now or later. Before installing the new crankshaft pulley, we're going to move on and modify our AC compressor pulley, converting it from a 4-rib to a 6-rib. The first step in modifying our AC compressor clutch is going to be to remove the 10mm bolt that holds the clutch face to the compressor. After loosening the 10mm bolt, simply grab the clutch face, wiggle it, and it'll pull right off. After removing the clutch face, you'll need to use a set of external snap ring pliers to remove the snap ring that holds the pulley to the compressor. Once the snap ring is removed, you can use a 3-jaw puller you can rent from any auto parts store to remove the AC pulley. After removing the AC pulley, you'll need to remove the 3 Phillips head screws that hold the AC magnet to the compressor. Before removing the magnet, make sure to unplug. Reinstall the provided magnet with the 3 new screws that already have Loctite installed on them. Be sure to plug back in your magnet and install where the stock push pins go. To install your new 6-rib AC pulley, use a wood block and a rubber mallet to press on. You will be able to audibly hear and you will be able to see when it's pressed on far enough. Install the snap ring, making sure to still have the beveled edge out. To help with ease of installation, put a tiny dab of grease on each of the shims before you put them in the AC clutch face. That way they cannot fall out when lifting it up into place. Install your clutch face, tighten the provided 10mm bolt with Loctite, and verify you have 16 to 18 thousandths of an inch of air gap in between the clutch face and the pulley. To reinstall our crankshaft pulley, you're going to need to use the supplied bolt that is a little bit longer. Then we can use our stock bolt to tighten and finish the install of the crank pulley. Before we install it, put a dash of RTV into the keyway to ensure we don't have any oil leaks from the front main seal. We're going to start by getting it on the little bit you can by hand, ensuring that you have the keyway lined up. Then, using the provided longer bolt, start pressing the crankshaft pulley on. Try to get it on about halfway before you pull the longer bolt out and put the stock bolt back in to finish the install. Make sure it threads in at least 3 full turns before hitting the crankshaft pulley so that it does not strip out when we start tightening it down. Run it down with an impact until the bolt bottoms out. Then use a torque wrench to verify you are at least at the factory torque spec of 80 foot-pounds. The next step after installing our crankshaft and AC 6-rib pulleys is going to be to install our spider bracket. As you install the spider bracket, it is best to have the belt somewhat routed as you get it in place, as once you have it tightened down, it will be very difficult to get the belt routed. So to do this, you're going to need to go down around the AC pulley and then around the tensioner down to the crankshaft pulley, as seen in the diagram. After you have your belt loosely routed, you can start the 3 spider bracket bolts. The 2 longer ones go in the left and bottom holes. The 1 shorter one goes in the top right into the FIAD bracket. After your spider bracket is on and tight, you can install the 2 provided smooth idlers. Ensure they are all the way on the Vosses on the FIAD bracket, then use the provided 13mm bolts to tighten them down. Once your pulleys and spider bracket are in place, you can reinstall the water pump pulley as it will not be in your way anymore. Make sure to use a dab of blue Loctite on each of the bolts as this is a moving part. Get the water pump bolts as tight as you can without the pulley spinning, then reinstall your accessory drive belt. After the belt is on and in place, you can then tighten your water pump bolts as the pulley will not be spinning. The first step to removing our front bumper is going to be to remove the secondary hood latch. To do this, remove the 10mm bolt, grab the latch, move it towards the passenger side and lift up. Also remove the two 8mm bolts on either side of the secondary hood latch. Before we start to unbolt our bumper, make sure to unplug both fog lights on the driver and passenger side, if equipped. Then we can remove the four 21mm nuts that hold the bumper to the frame. After removing the four nuts, make sure to remove any of the push pins that hold air shields to the front bumper, and then you can pull it away from the truck. After you've removed the front bumper, you can remove the two push pins holding down the air diffusers to the frame rail. After you've done this, trim as shown. The last air diffuser modification you'll need to do is removing the large one that goes from underneath the radiator to the front bumper. Remove the push pins that go up from the diffuser to the radiator and set the diffuser aside as it will not be reused. Once you have your air diffuser sorted out, you can install the provided heat exchanger brackets. There are two holes already in the frame on either side that you will install the provided bolts into. Before installing the heat exchanger, you must first attach the rubber isolator bushings to the brackets on the heat exchanger. Simply snap them on and then push the metal bushing through the center. Repeat this process on the other side. Next, you're ready to mount your heat exchanger. Install it behind the brackets, push the bolts through from the back side, and then install the nuts on the front. Before we can mount our heat exchanger pump, if your truck is equipped with it, you need to remove the lower air diffuser. To do this, you just need to remove the two 13mm bolts and then remove the J-nut that is installed at the factory. To mount the heat exchanger pump, you install the bolts from the inside of the frame rail by once again reaching your hand in from the front. Then you can install the nuts from the bottom. With a little bit of red Loctite, tighten down the nuts. Now that our heat exchanger and intercooler pump are securely mounted, we can start working on our hoses. The first one to install will be the one that goes from the heat exchanger directly into the intercooler pump. Use your bulk hose to figure out about how much you need, cut it, and install. The next hose we're going to install is the one that goes from the intake manifold to the top of the passenger side of the heat exchanger. First, slide it onto the lower intake manifold on the lower port. Then you can pull it through in between the headlight and the radiator to go to the heat exchanger. The next hose will go off of the front of the intercooler pump, up against the frame rail, and then it will tuck back underneath the headlight and about the space where your factory airbox was, and will go up to our reservoir. The first step to mounting our heat exchanger reservoir is going to be to remove the plastic tab off of the stud holding the engine harness to the top of the fan shroud. Then you'll need to trim a little bit of the fan shroud as shown to make room for your new heat exchanger reservoir. After you've got the necessary clearance, using a 10mm socket or wrench, remove the factory stud and discard as we will not be reusing it. Using the bolt and spacer provided, you can now bolt down the intercooler pump's reservoir. After you have the reservoir mounted, you can then cut off another piece of your bulk hose to go from the top port on the intake manifold to the top port on the reservoir. Be sure that the hose will not interfere with the belt. The last hose we have to hook up is the one that comes off of the front of our intercooler pump, underneath the headlight, and up to the last port on our reservoir. Make sure to install the supplied nylon sleeving over any areas that are going to rub against the frame or the headlight. Now that our heat exchanger pump and the heat exchanger itself are mounted, we can start working on the wiring. The first step is going to be to mount the relays on the factory tab that is next to the coolant drain. Install this provided bolt through one of the relays. Then stick the bolt down through the factory tab found above the frame rail. Then you can install the second relay with a nut underneath. Next, plug in all your electrical connections. The connection with the metal locking tab on it goes to the heat exchanger pump. The other two plugs are what go to your electric fans on the back of the heat exchanger. After you have everything plugged in, make sure to zip tie all of the electrical harnesses up and out of the way safely where they won't rub anything and they will not be hanging. To hook up our ground for the heat exchanger's fan harness, we're going to remove the 10mm bolt that is on the inside of the passenger side frame rail. After removing the bolt, install your ground strap in between the bracket and the frame and re-torque the bolt. We're going to move on from the heat exchanger wiring for now, but don't forget that we have not hooked up the power wire or the two relays yet. We will do this at a later step. Next, we're going to move on to our throttle body and EVAP extension harnesses. The first step to our throttle body and EVAP extension harnesses is to cut the tape off of the throttle body connector that comes on it from the factory and straighten out the wires just by hand. Then, cut the 90-degree plastic elbow out of the EVAP connector. After you've modified your throttle body and EVAP connectors, you can plug in the extension harnesses. Then, route the radio suppressor plug from your heat exchanger harness up alongside the passenger valve cover and run your extension harnesses along with them to the back of the engine. You can leave these harnesses laying loose at the back of the engine until a later time. Next, we're going to move on to our fuel rails. The first step of putting together our fuel rails is to remove everything from the packages. Then, assemble as shown in the diagram. You will need to put the deadhead at the front of the passenger side fuel rail. You need to put the straight threaded fitting at the back of the passenger side fuel rail. On the back of the driver's side fuel rail, the 90-degree elbow, And then on the front of the driver's side fuel rail, the two 90-degree elbows and the adapter that makes it work with your stock fuel line fitting. Make sure to grease all O-rings and ensure they seat properly. The last step is to install the braided fuel line that connects from the straight fitting out of the back of the passenger side to the 90 on the right side of the driver's side. Ensure that it has a little bit of downward bend whenever it is installed in the vehicle. After you've assembled your fuel rails, you can lubricate and install all 8 provided injectors. Before you install your fuel rail and get anything else in your way, be sure to cut the factory EVAP line off of the hard line that comes up behind the driver's side cylinder head. Then, before you can discard that hose, make sure to cut the stock fitting out of it. It's best to do this with a razor as shown. After you've removed the fitting, insert it into the supplied hose and then slide the supplied hose with the fitting newly installed onto the metal line on the stock location. After you've got the stock EVAP line removed, you can now install your fuel rails and the fuel injectors. Grab those 4 bolts that you saved from earlier and install them back into the stock locations. Then, using a 10mm, tighten them down. After your fuel rails are tightened down and torqued, don't forget to reconnect the factory fuel fitting to the VMP fuel rails. Next, we're going to grab the plugs from the heat exchanger harness that we already routed along the passenger side valve cover. First, you're going to locate the radio suppressor plug that is mounted to the back of the cylinder head on the passenger side. Then, grab your VMP harness and plug it in line with the radio suppressor plugs. After you've got it clipped in securely, you can wrap up any excess harness you have, zip tie it, and then tuck it neatly away behind the cylinder head. Next, we're going to route and mount our power supply for the VMP heat exchanger harness. First, mount your fuses to the wire harness located next to the battery box. After you have them zip tied nice and pretty, you can run the power wire up underneath the radiator hose to the positive battery terminal. Using a 10mm, remove the factory nut, install the VMP heat exchanger's power wires underneath, and then reinstall the nut. After you're done installing your VMP heat exchanger wiring harness, you can move on to our IAT2 harness. We're going to be removing and working with the far left connection on the vehicle's PCM. So the first things first is to, of course, undo the connector at the PCM. Then you can remove the black wire support on back of that connector, which usually just involves removing the tape and undoing the connectors. Then remove the pin locking device from the front of the connector. A pick will be handy with doing all of this stuff. The supplied IAT2 harness will have one end with a pin on it and the other end will just be wired. The blunt wire will have to be spliced into the wire location in pin C56 of the connector, and the wire that has the pin already installed will need to go into C36 of the connector. There's already going to be a blank inserted into that connector that you will need to push out either with a pick, a small drill bit, or whatever you can find to make work. After you push the blank out, you can insert the supplied wire and pin into the connector. It only goes in one way, so make sure to look at how the connector goes in, look at the other ones around it, and verify that it locks in place, as it only locks in one way. After you have your wires where they're easy to work with, you can strip both ends of them, and then make sure you do not forget to slip a little bit of heat shrink over. Resolder all three wires back together. The original wire back along with our IAT2 harness in line with it. After you are done soldering, you can slip the heat shrink back up and seal it with a heat gun or with an open flame. After you have the wire harness reassembled, you can insert the plug back into the ECU. We can move on to installing our new spark plugs. The first step is going to be to remove the 8mm bolts that hold in the ignition coil. Remove the ignition coil, then you can remove your factory spark plug. With your factory spark plug removed, gap it down to 30 thousandths of an inch, or if you option to purchase spark plugs through the kit, gap those to 30 thousandths as well. After you have re-gapped all your plugs, you can reinstall all 8 and reinstall the ignition coils and the 8mm bolts. Up next, we're going to reinstall the factory bumper. First, slide it on the car and get the studs through the frame rails. Then you can go underneath and start the 4 nuts by hand. Before tightening, make sure to lift up on the bumper. You should be able to see where the nut was rubbing previously on the back of the frame. After all 4 nuts are tight, you can plug back in your fog lights and then work on the secondary hood latch. Reinstall the 10mm bolt that holds the hood latch to the bumper. Then you can reinstall the 2 8mm bolts that go through the bumper down to the plastic. The first step to mounting our engine's new coolant reservoir is going to be to bolt the bracket up in the factory location using the 2 factory 13mm bolts. Then, using the supplied bolts and nuts, install the coolant reservoir to the bracket. After that is secured and tight, you can reinstall the factory hood sensor using the 10mm nut. After tightening down the reservoir and the hood sensor, you can reinstall the factory coolant line that goes from the reservoir to the top of the driver's side of the radiator. For the coolant line that goes from the bottom of the reservoir to the front of the engine, you're going to use your bulk 3/4 inch hose and using the supplied clamps, tighten it to the reservoir, then route down around the front of the engine to the factory water outlet and reinstall that clamp as well. Zip tie as necessary to secure the hose and verify it will not rub on anything. We're almost ready to install our supercharger. So the first step of assembling our supercharger is going to be to install the brass 90-degree elbow. Point it directly at the bypass valve and then using the bulk supplied hose, install a piece of hose going directly from the bypass valve to the brass fitting. After you have that installed, we can work on installing our EVAP solenoid using the supplied bolts and spacers. After removing your factory EVAP solenoid from the stock intake manifold, you can get ready to install it on the supercharger. To do this, slide the bolts through the holes, then put the spacers on the bolts and start both bolts by hand. After you have them both running by hand, you can tighten down with a 5mm Allen. The last thing we need to do to our supercharger before it's ready to go on the truck is to install the brake aspirator hose that we will later need to use to modify the brake aspirator assembly. Make sure to secure with a zip tie. If you purchased a Gen 3 supercharger, the preparation of the supercharger is almost identical, with the exception of one thing. There's a fitting already milled out on the back of the Gen 3 supercharger for a map sensor for other applications. You will need to install the provided spacer plate and bolt over that hole. After assembling the supercharger, it is ready to go on the truck. Put it down onto the truck, make sure it slides down onto the 2 alignment dowels, and then start all bolts by hand. After you've started all the bolts by hand, you can tighten them down in a crisscross pattern. After your supercharger is on the truck and torqued down, you can install your supercharger pulley using the provided 6 bolts. Once again, tighten them in a crisscross pattern as tight as you can while holding the pulley by hand. We will put a final torque on these bolts after the belt is on, helping us hold the pulley. Using a 17mm socket and ratchet, you can push down on the belt tensioner and then slip the belt over the supercharger pulley. Make sure to check the torque on your pulley bolts after the belt is on. After our belt and pulley are on and tight, we can install the EVAP hose that we earlier left on the factory fitting and make sure to plug in the extension harness into the EVAP solenoid. Moving to the passenger side of the truck, we can also install the PCV hoses that we installed on our lower intake manifold before we set it on. The next thing we need to modify is the heater hose that goes to the fitting on the driver's side of the engine. The first step is to cut off the plastic crimp using an angle grinder. After you remove the plastic crimp, you can use a razor blade to split open the hose and then pull the factory fitting out of the heater hose. After you've removed the factory fitting, cut the heater hose along the passenger side somewhere where it is in a straight part. You do not want to cut where there is a bend anywhere. Approximately halfway back the supercharger is a good spot. You can install the supplied splice fitting and hose clamps. Then, using another piece of your 3/4 inch bulk hose, route the hose around the front of the engine next to the factory fuse box and then down to the factory coolant fitting on the driver's side. After you have your heater hose in place, Verify that it will not interfere with any moving parts such as the belt. Use a zip tie to secure your heater hose to the factory fuse box. After the heater hose is in place, we can install our throttle body and billet spacer. Plug in the throttle body's motor, which is located on the inboard side next to the blower. Then start all 4 bolts by hand. Verify that all gaskets are centered up as best as they can be. You can do this just by running your hand underneath and making sure they're not drooping too far. And you can tighten them down with a 5mm Allen. Make sure to also plug in the throttle position sensor on the right side. When installing the Gen 3 supercharger with one of our twin bore throttle bodies, the first step will be installing the adapter plate. Make sure to install the gasket and line it up with the holes. Insert the 2 20mm long bolts on the left hand side and begin threading those into the blower while leaving them loose, but just hand tight. Then you can line up the throttle body with the spacer, making sure to install both gaskets on either side of the spacer, and then push the 2 70mm bolts through the right side of the throttle body and also thread them in by hand. Then thread in your remaining 2 bolts by hand and begin tightening in a crisscross pattern. Make sure to tighten down the 2 bolts that you left loose on the throttle body adapter on the left hand side. The first step to modifying our aspirator tube is going to be to pull off the line that went to your factory or aftermarket cold air intake tube. It is located on the gray part of the aspirator. You can pull it off and disregard it. Then we're going to work on the hose that went to previously the intake manifold. Loosen the clamp, and then you can take the hose off and also throw that to the side as it will not be reused. Next, we're going to modify the hose that previously went straight to the brake booster. First, you're going to cut it off at the straight section about 2 inches away from the bend. Then we can set that to the side and remove the fitting that goes into the brake booster from the hose that we just cut off. After you have removed the fitting, make sure to transfer the clamp from this piece of hose to your new hose on the aspirator assembly and reinstall with the brake booster fitting. Next, we're going to continue to modify the hose that previously went straight to the brake booster. About 4 inches back from the 90-degree bend, cut the hose and disregard the piece of 2 or 3 inches that is left. Then you can slip that hose onto the port underneath the brake booster hose. Make sure to secure with a zip tie. You want the 2 ends orientated as shown in the video, where the 90s are basically facing opposite of each other. Before we can put the aspirator on, you'll need to modify the hose that we already installed on the back of the supercharger. All you need to do is cut it off somewhere where it is straight about even with the brake booster, right about under the throttle body. Then you can slip the remaining port on the aspirator into that hose. Once again, make sure to secure with a zip tie. After it's secured and zip tied, you can reinstall the plastic fitting into the brake booster and plug back in the sensor. If you have a 4-wheel drive, do not forget to connect the vacuum line that also goes to the top of that plastic brake booster fitting. After we have our aspirator in place, we're going to assemble our cold air intake. The first step is going to be to slip the mass airflow housing onto the filter. Then start all 3 nuts by hand. After you have all 3 nuts started by hand, you're going to take a 9mm and an extension and run them down snug all by hand. After you have them tight by hand, you can give them a little snug with a ratchet. Next, we're going to install our silicone couplers. The one that is slightly shorter than the other will go onto the map housing in between the tube. Make sure to slip your clamps over before you slide the tube in. Then, take your other silicone coupler and you can slide it over the other end of the cold air intake tube. The last step of preparing our cold air intake for install in the truck is going to be to remove the small fitting opposite of the PCV fitting. After you've removed it, you can then install the supplied plastic fitting that will thread right in. Thread it in as far as you can by hand and then tighten up with a wrench. Now that our intake is together, we're going to install it onto the throttle body. Before you get too far along, make sure to hook up the hose that goes from the aspirator to the cold air intake. Get the hose clamp centered up and then tighten onto the throttle body. After you are tight on the throttle body, then you can get the tube centered and tighten the clamp that goes from the silicone coupler to the intake tube. Then make sure to snap on your PCV hose. After your cold air intake's in place, you can use your bulk supplied coolant hose and go from the water outlet on the top of the engine on driver's side to the last fitting on your coolant reservoir. Then tighten using the supplied clamps. After your coolant hose is in place and routed, you can install the factory mass airflow sensor that you removed out of your stock intake into the PMAS. Then, after tightening the screws, make sure to plug it in. One of the last steps before starting the truck is going to be filling our degas bottle and heat exchanger reservoir with coolant. It is best to do this with a vacuum bleeder. However, conventional methods like filling and burping the system by hand will work. After filling your coolant reservoirs, you can reattach the negative battery cable using an 8mm and tighten it down. Then, before we can start the truck, we need to reinstall the fuel pump relay in the factory fuse panel under the hood. The last step before starting the truck is going to be to load your VMP tune using either your SCT or HP tuner's device. Follow the prompts on the device. If using an SCT, it will ask you if you want to disable the preloaded tunes. The answer is yes, as you are going to be using our custom VMP tune. Verify that you have coolant flow in the heat exchanger system by popping the cap, and with the key on, you should be able to visibly see flow. After you start the truck, verify there are no fuel leaks at all fittings and at the injectors. Also, you may notice that the fans and intercooler pumps stay on a few seconds after you shut the key off. That is completely normal. Thanks for following along with me. Make sure to hit that subscribe button below and enjoy your new VMP Supercharged truck.